So our speaker is Barron Evans. Barron Evans is a career-long global change management consultant. And he says that change is an inevitable part of life, whether vocational, academic, political, or personal. While it can be challenging and even discouraging at times, it holds the potential to be incredibly exhilarating. In this session, Barron, who is a 1977 graduate of Olivet College and is an award-winning distinguished alumni, he has done some great work for the university as an ambassador. Thank you, Barron. He will draw on his 35 years of experience in leading change management for Fortune 500 companies across 8 states and 3 countries. He'll guide us through a fundamental process for navigating change and help us to build resilience and confidence so that we can face uncertainty head on when we're out there as courageous leaders. So we're going to discover how understanding the nature of change can empower us to embrace it as an opportunity for growth and leadership. Barron, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and get your PowerPoint put up, and then you are welcome to get started.
Thank you so very much, Kelly. Sure appreciate the opportunity. And real quick question, did the slides go out yet to these participants? Will that happen after the fact?
I will be putting the slides in the chat while you are speaking, and I will also be sending out a link to everyone.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, I will say welcome to everybody while Kelly is doing her great work, and I've got to send a shout out to her for just this tremendous initiative that she's undertaken on behalf of the full leadership community, certainly at Olivet and beyond. And Kelly, just know that everything you've done leading up to this is to be applauded, and everything you will do surely going forward from it will be supported. So thank you for what you're doing for us and for all the participants here today. So let's go ahead and get started. And as Kelly said in the introduction, I actually am a graduate of Olivet College. Now, for those of you that may or may not be from the Olivet community, because I understand some of those may be with us today, I did want to kind of give you a set or context for why I made the decision to use this particular cover on the slide. This is our semi-quarterly alumni magazine. I was formerly the chair of our alumni council up until this past May. And this particular edition was one that I think was absolutely the perfect way to establish the premise for what we'll talk about. Up until 2 years ago, for those of you that did not go to Olivet, we were Olivet College. And we were Olivet College that was founded in 1844. 2 years ago, as a part of the Board of Trustees work and very, very much work done behind the scenes with administration and leadership, there were some decisions made to move to become the University of Olivet. And I won't take you through all the pieces and permutations of that, but I will say that the sort of headline of this particular quarterly magazine to me just is exactly what it's about in the world of change, and that is moving forward. So I encourage us to think about that, and we'll talk about some of the reasons behind the forward momentum that change creates in all of our lives, sometimes in spite of us. And I'll ask with that point if Kelly, you'll flip to the next slide, please. So it's kind of a discussion guide. A good sort of, I think, host always attempts to give people a sense of where we're going. Sometimes easier than not in the change world. But for our purposes today, the next few minutes, to talk about navigating change in uncertain times, I want to provide sort of a premise for why and what that means. It's sort of the way that I've looked at it over the years. Provide an interesting and maybe a little bit controversial, and you'll see why momentarily, historical perspective on the notion of change. Some context for it and what it really means in the real world as we go through our daily lives, wherever and however our daily lives play out. We'll be discussing a cycle of change in a very simplistic way, and then sort of take a deeper dive into the process about change as we look toward moving to a different state. We'll then look at, I think, a very interesting psychological process, the learning, but just as importantly, the unlearning, because that's a critical component to moving any change forward. Also, then, we want to not miss the pace and propensity of change, because it will be affected by several different sort of other principles that I'll share with you. And then last, we'll talk about this sort of the takeaway from this, as Kelly alluded to, is about being an investment in who we are, where we're going, and what we choose to be. Next slide, please, Kelly. So I think as a premise, it's probably important just to kind of get some real fundamentals out of the way. And while we may look at the nature of the word change and the nature of what is the word navigation, it's so simplistic in its verbiage, maybe not so much, as we all can attest to, in the actual execution of it. So change really has a couple different meanings when you think of it in the context of being a verb. It's literally making something different, such as moving from this house to another house. But it also can be replacing with the same thing. So I changed my 40-watt light bulb that's burned out to another 40-watt light bulb. And so there's really kind of a couple levels of how we can think about change in the context of what it is intended to be, what it is in the action piece of it. And then obviously the noun sense of it simply says, it is something that has happened. We have made a change. The flip, though, and I think this is where it gets into a really interesting part of our discussion today, are these two words, carefully and safely. And if you think about the history of navigation and the whole seafaring nature of where it really began, and you think about some of the ships in early times trying to navigate their way across unsure waters, the best plans with the knowledge that they had to bear certainly didn't have the technology that we do today. But in all cases, to the degree that it could carefully and safely be thought about and planned ahead, most, not all the time, enabled it to then be a more successful journey. But sometimes, and this is called life, as much as we carefully and as much as we safely plan, there's going to be obstacles. And that's just called the nature of change. So part of what we'll discuss today then is a way to look at it, a process for it, and then how to move through it as carefully and as safely as we can. Next slide, please. There we go. So, don't know how many of you in this group today may or may not be familiar with The Prince. Certainly, it is a piece of historical literature that are in just about every library in the world. Many, including myself, during English literature classes at Olivet, read The Prince by Machiavelli. And when I think about it in the context of what we know historically was the intent behind Machiavelli and sort of ultimately what he was intending to do with the changes that he was forecasting, that he was going to bring to bear on society at his time, is probably not something that we would really want to endorse and embrace as one of the better changes. And, you know, to be perfectly candid, that is true. But I think we can't really miss sort of more the, what I'll call essence of the words that he was using as he was thinking about some of these heretofore changes that he was in the process of trying to embark upon. And so I'll give you a minute to read the words, and then I'll talk a bit about it. And the reason I wanted to share that with you today is that I think that regardless of where and in what context we have either made changes or we are facing change, one of the sort of fundamentals is there is nothing more difficult. There is nothing more challenging than to introduce something new. And it can be in any number of instances. And we'll talk about some of those occasions and instances in a few minutes. But when I think about the way that he presented this, it's pretty much founded in this notion of fear. And when I think about, and we'll talk a little bit about this, logistics or planning or doing sort of what I'll call the fundamentals of change, we think about it more in an organizational mode, sort of how do we take X and move to Y, and how do we do that? But when I think about that, yes, that is what you need to do in the planning phase. But we need to sort of not disavow that founded in whatever that change might be is this notion of fear. Fear of unsuccess, fear of not being able to accomplish whatever that intent was that we've set out on. And I think that the closing line really had an interesting observation as well about change is only fully embraced once there has been a long stretch of time to experience it. And when I read that, I couldn't help but flip back to that cover page and the choice of using the University of Olivet as that example. Because believe me, I wouldn't sit here and be a Pollyanna and say to you some of those Board of Trustees meetings and some of the discussions that were outside of those meetings were not all about embracing from the get-go and applauding and saying, we got this, we're going to make it happen. It came with pause. It came with fear. And certainly we will see, because we're only now just barely 2 years into it, what the future will hold. But I think these two sort of what I'll call underlying thought processes about fear and time in the course of change are really important for us to hold on to as we move forward. Next slide, please. So as I said and alluded to earlier, change is kind of endemic to everything we do. It's kind of everywhere. We can't argue that whether it's personally, whether it's professionally, academically, certainly this year, one couldn't argue that politically and societally, we're not seeing just a fair bit of change going on around us, of which we are uncertain, of which perhaps we do have fear, and we just don't have history. So we'll just be creating it real time as we go. But regardless of where you see change happening in our environments, in your personal or professional or academic spaces, it is there and it will continue, and we will not really be able to turn it. But what we can do is think about it in a way to manage it in a more effective way. And I wanted to bring a couple examples to life what that might mean. So Kelly, if we could flip to the next slide. So first, because I thought of the nature of the participants today, that I was going to really use the academic universe, and then the second example in a moment, the organizational universe, and how we think about change. When you get these slides, you'll be able to hone in on all the fine detail in the bottom right-hand graphic. I wasn't going to try to play through that in this discussion, but I did replicate the larger, what I'll call more macro level 8 elements that in this particular research does highlight the nature of what is in higher education, the several pieces and parts that are playing out and what it is and how we do what we do. And I think that as I look at these 8 and we go sort of deep into each one, we can really begin to get a sense of, well, gosh, the nature of whether I'm a student in this universe, whether I'm an administrator, whether I am faculty, fill in the blank. I have all of these elements that are a part of my daily life. Some play out larger, some maybe not so much on a day-to-day basis, but none of them can be forgotten or overlooked as still within the nature of education. And so the 3 that I kind of pulled out for me, which really pop, and I think that they will be very self-evident to many of you in terms of, so what are the ones significantly in the change world that affect higher education? For me, one of the ones that just is really clear and really foremost is the one called network and connections. And I heard it said somewhat, and I love this sort of analogy. Connections are my currency. Networks are my net worth. Connections are my currency. Networks are my net worth. So if I just take that one big bundle of thinking and sort of process through where these networks and connections are in our respective lives. Obviously, we'll have family networks, we'll have friendship networks, we may have church or other organizational networks. Certainly, if we're in school, we'll have our academic networks. And if we're in our business environment, we'll have our business networks. But I think this one, probably, if anyone, plays out certainly the largest, and I might also say the longest over the course of our lifespan. And it's within that very sense that I'll lead then to the second one that I see popping for me, and that is the element of support. So if networks are my net worth and connections are my currency, most of us look to that set, that body, that universe of people to be our support over the course, certainly, of our educational career, our professional career, etc. But with change, not only change that we might bring to bear, but also changes that that support network might have brought upon themselves, that support ebbs and flows. It can ebb and flow through a number of different circumstances. We'll talk about some of those environmental impacts in a few moments. But that support piece, I think, is really a dynamic. The networks and connections are there or they're not there, but then the level of support they provide you are really ever changing just because of the nature of the world that they are in and the world that we are in. And I think the other one, and this is no surprise, and I want to purposely highlight it third on this page, is the career pathways. And then that'll lead us in a moment to the next slide. But what I want to say here is in the world of change, those of you that know me, perhaps, may or may not recall that one of my Olivet majors was in political science. And interestingly enough, in my year between my junior and senior year, I took a professional semester, as they were called at that time, and went to Washington, D.C. to have a professional semester right in the hotbed of politics of our country. Standing here today before you, numbers of years later, and I'll just leave it there, I have never once held a position in politics, in the federal sector, state, local constituents. So it's important to know, can we flip back real quick? And then we go, okay, just real quick to finish this up. So it's important to know when we talk about career pathways, and that's my one example, all of you probably have your own versions, but change can happen even in the nature of what I think I'm intending to do while I'm still in an academic area, and then ultimately what life plays out for me to do. Okay, Kelly, we flip to the next one now. Perfect. Okay, so this is another piece of eye candy. And so you'll have a chance to look more in detail at this when the slides are provided to you. But when I talk about now the largest other big area, the organizational universe, again, there are no small components that live here. I mean, it is just self-evident to all of us that even though we may not necessarily extract any one of these in any certain moment in our professional lives, we can't argue the fact that each of them plays a role, some explicitly, some much more implicitly. So the three that I always like to think about as I sort of look at this universe, and I think about, well, which ones probably have the highest propensity to be change agents and to then influence me or the rest of the organization in the change process. The three that pop for me first would just be leadership. We all know, regardless of what kind of an organization that we work, that leadership just is dynamic in its own right. The personalities of the people, certainly the histories of the people, the way that they manifest leadership qualities or not, because we've all known those as well. The way that that leadership inspires or disincentivizes the way that we look at our work and our workplace, that's another big thing that I always think about in the terms of, and heaven forbid, if that leadership changes. And when we talk about leadership, certainly my boss is a leader, my boss's boss is a leader, and it goes all the way up to the C-suite. So it's not just one person or one level, but it is a set of people who are billed and called managers that are considered leaders. And we know when those shifts happen with them, they can also then impact us. Another big piece that kind of goes with that, and I think if you flip to the other side of the slide, is the management processes. So if I have leadership, and in theory, the way the organization has set it up, the way that this organization functions and the way it operates more or less successfully is through the processes that the management team establish. And as somebody who's background and practice through the years has been in change management, it is particularly, I think, interesting area to think about that processes are set up to hopefully make more efficient, make more effective, whatever output they're intended to deliver. That is the right intent to have. But then the real world kicks in and things happen. And lest we forget where we all were 3 years ago in this thing called COVID. And if we can not ever want to hope to revisit that again, but if we could reflect on the changes in processes that created, I don't care who you are, I don't care where you were, it created a macro change at a level we've probably never seen, certainly in my lifetime. So that's another big piece that I don't want to lose sight of in the context of the organizational universe. But the other one, and I think probably at the end of the day, if I were to sort of say, what's the one that I would extract and call the biggest piece within the organizational universe, is this one that I, by design, put at the bottom: culture. Because culture underlies everything we think, we do, we feel. It is the nature of all organizations. And in this case, I used it in the professional sense. We could put culture in the one before this in the academic sense. It lives in every environment. I don't care where you are. It is just the nature of where we are, what we do, that plays out through its history, through what are called the beliefs and the attitudes and the mores of that organization. So I wanted to draw out these two examples, both the academic one and the organizational one, so that we could kind of get a sense of, so where does this change all take place, and what are we doing within those if we play a role amongst them? Okay, Kelly, let's jump to the next slide, please. So if that's sort of all the background and premise and the why and the what, now I want to kind of move us forward to the so what. I kind of always have a way of thinking about anything that I do. It's the what, the so what, and the now what. So we've just talked a little bit about the what. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the so what. I know something, I'm visualizing something, I'm experiencing something. We're in some cycle of change wherever we sit in our lives. These and this slide is probably the most simplistic way to set that up. It's just sort of giving us a sense of, well, we start somewhere. We may not have this beautiful, easy demarcation, be able to say, oh, I know when that started and when that stopped. It's not that clean. But what it is sort of a sense of, theoretically, as change is evolving, somewhere, somebody, me, my boss, my partner, my company, has been thinking about a change. All of that, obviously, was thinking about a change a few years ago. That evolves into the next big piece, preparation. In the best of all worlds, that preparation will be done effectively with input from a breadth of stakeholders. I know work that I've done in the pharmaceutical industry. It was always easy to look to the executive team or maybe sort of a certain tier or level within the organization. But my pushback was always, well, why are we talking to people in other parts of the business that may not interact with the outside world, but certainly are going to be players within the way this change is intended to play out? And so making sure we prepare in as best a way possible what we're trying to accomplish in this change. The third one, the implementation, no small thing. We've all been there. We've all done that. We've all implemented change at some place in our lives. Some are very simple, straightforward, and I applaud those that do happen that way. Others, not so much. And then the last one, which I think oftentimes gets short-sheeted and should be integral to the preparation phase, I might add, we'll talk about this in a second, is the evaluation phase. What have I determined in planning this change will be the benchmarks or the metrics that I will then evaluate its success thereafter. Next slide, please. So when you think about this notion of, if those are the four big buckets of the change cycle, now let's talk about a process to begin to evolve us to a place of what we desire that outcome to be. And so my premise in just about all changes, personally, professionally, organizationally, is always to try to start with the end in mind. And what does that mean? That means coming up with or helping to visualize or helping to organize what that final change should be. Now, I know different people may have different ways to think about that. My personal bias is I like to describe it behaviorally. And when I say behaviorally, what I mean is what actions am I? What actions are others? What actions is the organization actually doing or taking when this change has now been implemented and is effective? I would always caution people when they think about planning for change to use what I call future tense kinds of change statements. We will be, I will be, I can be. You will be able to say, I will be, I can be 25 years from now and still have done nothing. So the orientation is try to the degree possible, and wherever this change is taking place, to be personal, present tense in the way you're organizing. What does that desired outcome? So if we kind of get that in our head and start framing that with whatever is necessary to frame it for us or our company or our school, we then look at sort of this 7 or 6 phase process. And I just kind of bucketed them in big 3 phases of see, move, improve. C, and I'm not going to go through all these iteratively, but I think one that is in C that I cannot help but call out is phase 2. What is the desired outcome that we just talked about, but something that will make me think differently, feel, and do differently. Think, feel, and do differently. Because without those 3 sort of being elemental or fundamental to the way that we're thinking about the change that we're choosing to proceed on, I can think about things all day long and keep it at the intellectual level. But if it doesn't translate to the doing level, and as we talked about earlier with our friend Machiavelli, if you can't not fear it, then you're missing the 3 important elements of seeing what that is to you today. Again, we're still in the C place. The move then gets into sort of now that I have sort of some of that definition, I have a sense of where I am, but more importantly now where I would like to be, what do I need to do? What are the things I need to put in place? What are the elements that I need to begin to establish? It could be a new habit. It could be getting up a half an hour earlier in the morning. It could be eating a different food. It could be having discussions with people in my organization with whom I've not had discussions before, but help me potentially feed my change in a more effective way because now I'm getting perspectives from others I may not have spoken to before. And as I alluded to a moment ago, this improved piece. Change indeed happens in spite of us, but we don't just kind of get there and stop. The thought always is, how can I continuously improve what I am doing, what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking? And that's just, again, endemic to the change process. Next slide, please. Okay, this is more of an eye bug too, and I want us to kind of get through it pretty quickly. But the 2 are really mirror images of one another. But when we talked about fear in the beginning and just talked about feeling in the last set of discussion, this really sets up, I think, all humankind's natural evolution and responses to change. You know, shock, disbelief, sort of withdrawal, slow acceptance, maybe a better sort of practicing and doing, and then ultimately feeling a sense of confidence when I get to a place, whatever that might be. And again, I'm always talking here on the personal, organizational levels. So think about it in both of those contexts. But what I don't want us to lose sight of, and that's the purpose of having sort of the second graphic on the right side, is that while this time is evolving and while this change is taking place, the change is evolving too. And so are the elements that have been part of the change. And so what I don't want us to have misgivings on is when, just as easily as we think we've accomplished it, a new loss or a new change comes into place, comes into our lives for some reason or another, either brought by us, brought by others around us, brought by the organization, fill in the blank. But I think that's the key to understanding that learning change and understanding change has to also encapsulate that it is ongoing. And there are phases of it, emotionally, intellectually, that just are a part of it. And you've all experienced it, whether it's been conscious or subconscious, you all are aware of this. But it's the nature of being able to be okay with it, recognizing it, knowing what our friend Machiavelli said about until you've had long amount of time to become accustomed, that you begin to see that this is part of that process. Next slide, please. In that process, I'm going to make the case that we really always have to step back in each of the phases, whatever we're trying to accomplish in our change, and ask ourselves, what do we believe versus know to be true? I'm not going to take you through all these questions, but again, nowhere can that be more evident than in this political year in this United States of America. And it's not always easy to sort of force others to think about what they believe to be true, but I would argue it's even harder to ask ourselves, what do I believe to be true? And more so, why do I believe it to be true? So this is kind of what I call the 30,000 foot of realization, is come to terms with how do I get to truth? And that plays out in every phase of our change. Next slide, please. And what does that look like? So we think about that evolution of change and the pace of change. We really have these four particular, what I'll call consciousness states, for lack of a better way to describe them. You've probably seen them all before, and I think they're all pretty self-evident by the way that we've defined them here. But I'd like to think about them as just the ways that many changes happen in our daily lives. We don't know what we don't know, and that's the nature of the human world. But then once we begin to understand, well, something exists, I still may not know what it means, then we're conscious of it. We then, if we choose, and this is the key part, if we choose, move on to now wanting to understand it. What do I need to learn? What do I need to understand? To whom do I need to go ask to be able to be more conscious of what this new learning, this new thing is? To a place where ultimately then it becomes so integrated into the think, feel, do, it's now unconscious competence. Next slide, please. The four psychological concepts that play out here, and this has to do more with a propensity change, are these four elements: the default effect, the familiarity principle, social proof, and habit-based identity. I'll give you a moment to read what each of those mean. But again, what we're going to talk about, if you do have a chance to look at these, because I'm paying attention to time here, is not just that you know them, not that you just have a sense of what they mean, but the recognition of what they stand for in the context of you personally or organizationally going through the change process. Each of these are very, very much core to we as human beings, how we are and how we choose to change. Next slide, please. So if we think about those four areas, and we think about, well, how then do I manage them? If they exist and I can't really do anything about them, how am I going to manage the change that I'm seeking, or that my company's seeking, or that my personal life partner and I are seeking? Because again, that's a very intimate level of changing. These are sort of the ways that one could look at how do I then begin to re-engineer any of these four in a way that continually holds true to what is your desired outcome. And again, that's our true north. That's what we should always be holding up as where we are heading, defined early on, but then looking at the fact that in some cases, my choice of change may not meet with the sort of friendships or the sort of social circles with which I engage currently. It may require that certain habits that I've always had, I now have to change. And in this re-engineering process, there's going to be huge amounts of discomfort, huge amounts of just uncertainty. But it is in this very recognition that these things exist and in the very willingness to take them on toward that greater good that we need to come to terms with why change and how change can be effective for us. And the last slide before we open up a Q&A, please. So what I'd like to just leave with everybody, and I think this is true no matter where you see it, no matter where you experience it, I go to the gym 3 times a week, and that's just a personal commitment I've made to myself for years. But when I think about what I'm doing at the gym, and I'm trying to think about, am I building muscle? Well, not so much at this age, but I'm trying to keep fit. I'm trying to keep toned. But if I kind of get myself out of that sort of purely physical sense of muscle building, what I look at now more realistically, and this is true for all of us, resilience is the single biggest muscle that we will continue to invest in, to build on, and to grow as we navigate change over our lifetimes. Wherever we go, whatever we do, with whomever we choose to do it, it is the nature and the core of change, but it's also something that we can do and work and build and grow in each of those change phases. And to close with what our friend said at the front, there's nothing more fearful to embrace change and to recognize that to take change is going to be a long time before we realize it. And so without the resilience as an investment, the chance of the change is going to be much more limited. So I applaud you in thinking about these principles, carrying these principles forward, and doing what you do, navigating your life, recognizing the principles that we brought today. Thanks so very much for your time. I appreciate it, and we'll certainly open now to Q&A.
Barron, while we're waiting for folks to think of their questions, I will let you know that I'm going to get that file posted. We do have full power back on the campus of the University of Olivet.
Excellent.
So kind of I was
Excellent.
kind of throttling the things that we could accomplish here, but I'm so glad that we were able to spend this time with you and learn about the process of change and how all the choices we have of how to respond. And as leaders, our followers are going to see how we respond, and they're going to take our lead on those things. They'll do what we do, not what we say.
It's human nature.
So thank you for helping us spend the time really doing that self-evaluation and that processing of how do I deal with change? And so it may give a lot of us some things to put on our to-do list. I loved the 4 quadrants of, it was like the Johari window of the unconscious and the conscious, to help me try to understand, okay, what am I not thinking about? What am I not realizing in my approach to change? And so I appreciate that in particular. And the see, move, improve was another stretch. And if we had another, we're going to have to go out for coffee and talk more about this, because thinking about that see, move, and improve, to all of our courageous leaders out there, in that process, there's going to be situations where people are going to be like, no, I'm not moving. I am not moving. And so that situation, we have to get creative, because when everyone says okay and moves forward, everything's great. It's all, cake and ice cream. But when someone says no, then all of a sudden we need to come up with plan B. So as leaders, that resilience is so important.
So key. And I think too, that's why I wanted to talk about those 4 psychological principles about default and social and habit, because in the very thing you just described, Kelly, is that level of discomfort. I might be in a work group, I might be in a team, I might be in any kind of group setting. And if I see the movement happening and I don't feel that I'm connected to that movement for any number of reasons, there's going to be a psychological break for them as well as for me. And being able to come to terms with how that comfort level is managed has everything to do with that resilient muscle.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for encouraging us to get working out on those muscles, on that resilience muscle.
My pleasure.
In particular, awesome information for us to keep and hang on to. And
well, thank everybody so very much.
I want to encourage everyone to think about, if you have questions, or if you want to know more, or if there's something in particular that Barron shared with us that you're like, you know what, I want to dig in a little bit, maybe we could have a chat. Go to our leadership learning community out on Canvas. It's the LDR 900 class. And if you're a member of the Olivet community and have an Olivet email and can log into Canvas, you can jump into those discussion forums and you can start a conversation about any of the topics that we're working on today. And I can connect you back with the speakers so that you can continue the dialogue. So if if there's more, if you want to begin, definitely reach out. Barron, thank you for investing in this important work of growing courageous leaders. Thank you for being a courageous leader yourself and for serving at the level you serve here at the University of Olivet and being a great model of the passion for the Hill. Thanks so much.
Thanks to all of you. Enjoy a wonderful weekend and the rest of your sessions today.
Thank you so much. Take care.